he told her never to come back and slammed the door. 3 years later, he saw her again, this time with twins who had his eyes. The night was sharp with winter air, the kind that bit into the skin and carried silence in its wake. Inside the grand house, the marble floors reflected the glow of golden chandeliers, but no amount of light could soften the coldness in Jonathan's expression. He stood tall in the doorway, his chestnut hair falling slightly over his brow, his brown eyes as unyielding as stone. Across from him, Emily's blue eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She was trembling, her breath fogging in the icy air that crept in from the open door. For a fleeting moment she thought he might relent, that the man she had loved so fiercely might remember the promises he once whispered late at night. But instead, his voice came out like a blade, sharp, deliberate, final. "Don't come back." The words cut through her more cruelly than the cold ever could. She opened her mouth, desperate to plead, to explain, to fight for the life they had shared, but the look in his eyes silenced her. There was no space for her words, no crack in his armor, only pride and anger closing her out. His hand pressed against the heavy oak door, and she knew with certainty that the moment he shut it, everything would change forever. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped back, her heels crunching softly against the thin frost that had begun to settle across the steps of the mansion. The weight of his rejection pressed against her chest until she felt she might break apart right there in the darkness. She had imagined anger, she had even imagined disappointment, but nothing could have prepared her for the chilling emptiness of his dismissal. He was not shouting, not raging, and somehow that made it worse. His calmness told her that he had already decided, that she was nothing more than a closed chapter in the story of his life. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. She stood motionless on the stone steps, staring at the polished brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light, the barrier between her and the man she once believed would never turn his back on her. The world around her was hushed, as if even the night itself held its breath in sympathy. Snowflakes began to fall, slow at first, then faster, covering her hair and coat, but she didn't move. She felt as though she were frozen in place, a figure abandoned in a painting of heartbreak. Finally, with her strength waning, she turned away. Each step down the mansion's grand path felt like walking deeper into exile. The wind howled against her, whispering his words again and again, taunting her with the memory, "Don't come back." She wrapped her arms around herself as though she could hold her heart together, but nothing stopped the cracks from spreading. When she reached the edge of the property, she looked back one last time. The house loomed against the night sky, its windows glowing with warmth she no longer had any right to claim. She whispered a goodbye, though no one could hear it, and in that moment she swore she would never let him see her broken. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that she was already carrying a piece of him that no slammed door could erase. As the snow thickened around her, Emily stepped into the unknown with tears freezing against her cheeks, unaware that the secret she bore would one day force open the very door he had closed so firmly against her. Emily left the mansion that night with snow gathering on her shoulders, the echo of Jonathan's words following her like a curse. The city around her glimmered faintly in the distance, its lights sharp against the winter darkness, but none of it mattered because she felt as though the world had collapsed beneath her feet. She rented a small room above a bakery in a forgotten corner of town, a space that smelled faintly of yeast and sugar, but its walls were thin and the heat sputtered through unreliable radiators. It was not the life she had imagined when she first met Jonathan, not the dream of safety and partnership she had clung to, yet it became her refuge when she had nowhere else to turn. Each night she lay awake listening to the wind press against the window and replayed the sound of the door closing in her mind, trying to understand how love could transform into dismissal so quickly. Weeks passed in a haze of grief and fatigue until she discovered the truth that shifted her world again. She was carrying his children. The first time she realized it, her hands trembled so violently she dropped the small ceramic cup she had been holding, watching it shatter into pieces on the kitchen floor. She pressed both palms against her stomach, her breath catching in her throat, and for the first time since Jonathan had cast her out, she felt something other than despair. Fear swept over her, fear of raising a child alone, of living with the burden of responsibility without support, but beneath that fear flickered an ember of purpose. She would not crumble, not when 2 lives now depended on her. She whispered to herself in the quiet hours of the night that she would endure, that she would build a life from ashes if she had to, and that no cruel word from Jonathan could take away the love she already felt for the small hearts beating within her. Her pregnancy was not easy. She worked long hours despite the exhaustion, waiting tables until her feet throbbed, cleaning offices after closing hours, and taking on any odd jobs she could find. The money she earned was barely enough for rent and food, but she stretched every coin, learning to live on little so that she could prepare for the lives that were coming. She kept her secret close, telling no one about the identity of the father, because she could not bear the questions, the pity, or the judgment. She told herself that she did not need Jonathan's wealth or his name, that her daughters would grow up knowing love instead of pride and cruelty. But late at night, when she felt the twins stir inside her and the silence pressed too heavily on her chest, she admitted in whispers to the darkness that she wished things had been different. When the twins were born on a cold morning nearly a year later, Emily wept as she held them for the first time. 2 tiny girls, perfect and identical, with soft chestnut hair that framed their delicate faces and deep brown eyes that mirrored Jonathan's so clearly that Emily's heart ached with every glance. She named them Sophia and Isabella, names she had whispered during sleepless nights when she imagined their faces. Holding them, she felt the strength she had doubted surge through her. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of fear was worth it, because they were hers. The world outside the hospital room might still be cruel, but inside her arms was the warmth of a family she vowed never to let slip away. The first years were grueling, filled with endless nights of crying, fevers, and scraped knees, but Emily carried it all with quiet determination. She taught herself to sew so she could patch their clothes when they tore them climbing or running. She bartered with neighbors, trading her time for babysitting so she could work extra shifts. She read to them by candlelight when the power was cut off because she couldn't pay the bill, turning those moments into games so the girls never felt the heaviness of poverty. To them, she was both mother and father, shield and comfort, and though she often collapsed into bed with her body aching, she found joy in their laughter, their shared secrets, and their unwavering trust in her. Yet even in the beauty of motherhood, the shadow of Jonathan lingered. Sophia's serious gaze reminded her of him when he was deep in thought, and Isabella's mischievous grin carried an echo of the charm he once used to melt her heart. Sometimes she would catch her breath when one of them turned their head a certain way, and it was as though he were standing before her again, not with anger but with all the tenderness she remembered. She hated those moments because they made her wonder what might have been if he had not closed that door, if he had chosen trust over pride. But she forced herself to let those thoughts drift away. Jonathan was part of the past, and she had no space for him in the fragile life she had built. Emily reminded herself daily that her daughters were her purpose now, her reason to rise when everything in her body told her to collapse. She whispered promises to them at night, promises that they would never feel abandoned, that they would never hear words like, "Don't come back," because she would always fight for them. She believed those promises with every fiber of her being, but what she did not know was that fate had its own plans, and the man who had closed the door on her life was already walking paths that would one day lead him back into hers, forcing her to confront the very secret she had fought so fiercely to keep hidden. The years that followed tested every ounce of strength Emily possessed. She often thought back to the woman she had been before the mansion door closed behind her, fragile and hopeful, and she hardly recognized that person anymore. Life had hardened her in ways she could never have imagined, but it had also shaped her into someone resilient, someone who no longer waited for a hand to guide her but built her own path even when the ground beneath her feet seemed unstable. With Sophia and Isabella by her side, she discovered a kind of courage she had not known she was capable of. Their apartment was a modest two-room place in a town where no one knew her history, where she could disappear into the flow of ordinary people without questions about the past. The rent was cheap because the ceiling leaked when the rain came and the windows rattled in the winter storms, but it was home. Emily decorated it with second-hand furniture and scraps of fabric she stitched into curtains, and though it was humble, the girls filled it with life. They scribbled their drawings on scraps of paper and taped them proudly to the walls, turning the worn-out plaster into a gallery of childhood dreams. Every corner of that apartment held the sound of their laughter, and that was what made it bearable. Sophia grew into a thoughtful child, her serious brown eyes always studying the world around her with quiet intensity. She often acted older than her 3 years, holding Isabella's hand tightly when they crossed the street, reminding her sister not to run too far ahead, almost as if she understood she had to share the burden of protecting their little family. Isabella, in contrast, was a whirlwind of energy and mischief. She loved to climb onto chairs, to sneak cookies from the jar, to laugh so loudly it filled the entire apartment. She had a way of brightening the darkest days, her grin so full of life that Emily sometimes felt tears burn her eyes just watching her. Together, the girls were inseparable, two halves of the same soul, and Emily often marveled at how different and yet how perfectly balanced they were. Providing for them was a relentless battle. Emily worked as a waitress in the mornings, rushing to the diner before dawn while the girls stayed with a kind elderly neighbor who had taken pity on her. At night she cleaned offices, her body aching by the time she returned home, but she never let her exhaustion show when she walked through the door. She would sit on the floor with her daughters, reading them fairy tales in a soft, steady voice, braiding their hair, or singing lullabies until they drifted to sleep. Sometimes, when the lights were turned off to save money on electricity, she lit a single candle and told them stories she invented, tales of princesses who never needed rescuing because they saved themselves and of brave sisters who faced the world together. The girls would fall asleep curled up against her, their small hands gripping hers as though they trusted her to keep the darkness away forever. There were moments of despair, nights when Emily lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how long she could go on this way. She often skipped meals so the girls could eat more, and she wore the same coat year after year, patching it repeatedly while buying new shoes for her daughters when theirs wore through. Sometimes the burden of loneliness weighed so heavily she thought she would drown under it. Yet each morning when Sophia and Isabella ran to her bed, their laughter spilling through the air like sunlight, she knew she would endure it all over again. They were her salvation, the proof that her life still had meaning. Still, the shadow of Jonathan lingered like a ghost she could not exorcise. Sophia's thoughtful frown would sometimes remind her of his expression during late nights when he was lost in his own thoughts, and Isabella's mischievous sparkle carried echoes of the charm that once disarmed her. Emily hated how often she saw him in them, because it tore open old wounds, but she loved her daughters too fiercely to let bitterness touch them. She never spoke his name, never told them about the man who had turned his back, but she knew one day she would have to explain. Already, the questions had begun to creep in. Sophia once asked quietly why they didn't have a father like the other children at the park, her little voice tentative, as though afraid of the answer. Emily's heart clenched, but she forced a gentle smile and told her that some families look different, and that all that mattered was love. The explanation seemed enough for now, but Emily feared the day when it would no longer be. Through all the hardship, she carried a fierce determination. She reminded herself constantly that the life Jonathan had denied her was not the one she wanted anymore. She no longer dreamed of mansions or wealth. She dreamed of simple things, keeping her daughters safe, giving them education, watching them grow without shame or fear. Her strength came not from bitterness but from the bond she shared with Sophia and Isabella, a bond she swore would never be broken. And yet, deep inside, buried beneath years of survival, there lingered a question she could not silence. What would happen if the man who had shut her out so completely ever saw the faces of the children who bore his eyes? Emily tried to push the thought away each time it arose, telling herself it would never happen, that Jonathan belonged to a world far from hers now. But fate had a way of weaving paths together, and while she carried on with her quiet battle, she could not know that the very man who had once turned her away would soon walk straight into the life she had built, and nothing she had prepared herself for would be enough to keep the past from colliding with the present. The winter morning in the mountains carried a sharp brightness, the kind that made every detail shimmer as though the world had been carved from glass and silver. Emily wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck as she stood outside the small rustic restaurant where she had been working since autumn, the warm scent of bread and coffee drifting out into the frosted air. Sophia and Isabella were bundled in matching coats, their brown eyes wide with delight as they chased each other through the snow, their boots crunching rhythmically across the frozen ground. Emily's laughter floated out as she called to them, warning them not to go too far, though her tone carried more love than sternness. For a brief moment, everything felt safe, as though life had finally settled into a rhythm she could trust. Then, across the road, the sound of a car door shutting broke through the stillness. A sleek black SUV stood stark against the snow, its polished surface glinting in the morning light. Emily paid it no attention at first. Tourists often came to the mountains this time of year, but the moment her eyes lifted and landed on the man stepping out, her heart stuttered violently in her chest. Jonathan. He was older now, but the years had only carved his features into sharper, more defined lines. His chestnut hair, dusted with a hint of frost, caught the light, and his deep brown eyes, once filled with coldness, swept over the scene with a detached focus. For a single, suspended heartbeat, Emily hoped he would not see her, that fate would show mercy and allow him to pass by. But his gaze did not slide past her. It stopped, fixed, and then dropped to the two small figures playing in the snow. Sophia's serious face lit up with laughter as she threw a snowball at Isabella, who dodged with quick grace before retaliating, both girls shrieking with delight. They were perfect reflections of each other, their matching brown eyes glowing, their hair catching the sunlight in the exact shade Jonathan had carried since youth. Jonathan's face drained of color, his entire body freezing as the truth slammed into him. He didn't need to ask. He knew. Emily's body went rigid, her arms crossing instinctively as she stepped forward, placing herself between Jonathan and the twins, though they had not yet noticed him. Her breath fogged heavily in the cold air as memories of the past surged back, the sound of a door slamming, the finality of his words, "Don't come back," still echoing after all these years. She wanted to run, to scoop her daughters into her arms and disappear into the safety of the little home she had built, but her feet refused to move. Her eyes locked on his, and time seemed to fold in on itself, pulling her back to the night everything had fallen apart. Jonathan finally found his voice, though it was rough and uneven, stripped of its former authority. "Emily," he breathed, almost in disbelief, as though her presence in this place defied all reason. His eyes flicked once more to the girls, and he stumbled forward a step, his hands half lifted as if reaching out to something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. Are they? The words caught in his throat, but the truth already hung heavily in the air, undeniable in every shared feature, every mirrored expression. Emily's heart clenched as she tightened her arms across her chest, her voice harder than she felt inside. "Your words were clear," she said, forcing the steel into her tone even though her hands trembled. "You told me not to come back. And I didn't." For a moment, the snow seemed to fall more heavily, as if the world itself sought to shield her and her daughters from the weight of this confrontation. She wanted to turn and walk away, to erase this collision of past and present before it could unravel the life she had fought to build, but Jonathan's face stopped her. His eyes were not filled with the same cold dismissal she remembered, instead they were raw, wide, shaken with a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. The twins, oblivious to the storm brewing, finally noticed the man standing a short distance away. Isabella, bold as always, called out, "Mama, who's that?" Sophia, more cautious, moved closer to her mother, her small hand slipping into Emily's coat pocket for reassurance. Emily's breath hitched at the sound of Isabella's voice, because in it Jonathan surely heard the echo of himself. She could see his hands trembling, see the battle raging behind his eyes as he took in the sight of the girls who were undeniably his own. For Emily, the moment was suffocating. She had spent 3 years building walls, convincing herself that he was gone forever, that the past no longer had the power to touch her. Yet here he was, staring at the children he had unknowingly left behind, and she knew the fragile balance of her life was about to shatter. She could not yet imagine what would come, whether Jonathan would fight to reclaim what he had lost or whether she would be strong enough to resist the pull of the man who had once destroyed her. All she knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. Jonathan stood in the snow as if the earth had shifted beneath him, his eyes locked on the twins with a mixture of awe and devastation. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck in his throat, tangled in regret that had been festering for years. Emily's face was pale against the winter light, her arms wrapped around herself, her entire posture screaming that she would not let him come any closer. The girls, still curious, lingered by her side, their questions bubbling up in small voices that Emily silenced with a quiet command to go back to playing. They obeyed reluctantly, though Sophia's eyes lingered on Jonathan with suspicion, while Isabella gave him a bold, lingering glance before skipping away. That brief exchange left Jonathan shaken because he recognized himself in Isabella's spark and in Sophia's thoughtful caution. Every second in their presence was a revelation and a punishment. When Emily finally spoke again, her words carried the sharp edge of years of pain. She told him he had no right to stand there, no right to look at the children who bore his eyes, no right to insert himself into a life he had chosen to abandon. Jonathan flinched as though each word struck him physically, but he did not retreat. Instead, he forced himself to face her, his voice low and hoarse as he admitted that he had been wrong. He confessed that on that night, 3 years ago, his pride had blinded him, that anger and mistrust had drowned out reason. He had believed lies, suspicions, shadows that should never have outweighed the love they had once shared. His hands trembled as he spoke, and for the first time Emily saw the cracks in the armor of the man she had once known only as unyielding. But her fury was not so easily disarmed. She stepped closer, her blue eyes blazing, and demanded to know where he had been when she faced nights of exhaustion so deep she thought her body would collapse. She told him of the nights when the girls were sick with fever and she sat awake for hours praying they would pull through, of the mornings she went to work hungry because she had given her last food to them, of the endless moments of loneliness when she carried the burden of parenthood alone. Her voice broke as she told him that while she sacrificed everything, he had lived comfortably, untouched by the reality of the family he had cast aside. Jonathan could not look away, though her words carved into him with merciless precision. He realized that nothing he endured in his own years of regret compared to the suffering she had faced in silence. He tried to reach for her, but she pulled back sharply, her expression warning him not to cross the fragile boundary between them. Still, he pressed on with his words, desperate to be heard. He told her that not a day had passed when he hadn't thought of her, though his pride had kept him chained to his own lies. He admitted that he had drowned himself in work, in wealth, in distractions, yet nothing silenced the echo of that door closing, nothing dulled the image of her face as she stood in the cold that night. His voice cracked when he said that he did not deserve forgiveness, but that he could not ignore the truth standing in front of him. The children were his, and he needed, the chance to know them, to protect them, to give them what he had once refused. Emily listened, but her heart warred within her. Part of her wanted to scream at him to leave, to vanish back into the life of riches where he belonged, but another part of her trembled with the memory of the man she had once loved, the man who had not been entirely erased by betrayal. She thought of Sophia and Isabella, of their questions about a father, of the way their eyes sometimes searched hers as though trying to fill a void they could not name. Her instinct was to protect them, to keep them from being hurt as she had been hurt, but she could not deny the truth any longer. The bond between father and children was already visible, as undeniable as the blood they shared. The conversation stretched on until the cold stung their faces and the girls grew restless with waiting. At last Emily said quietly that she did not trust him, that she could not simply let him walk into their lives after years of silence. But she also admitted that the choice was no longer only hers to make. Sophia and Isabella had a right to know the man who had given them life, and she would not rob them of that, no matter her anger. Her conditions were clear: if he wanted to be present, he would have to earn it through action, not words. He would have to prove that he was no longer the man who turned his back on them. Jonathan accepted her terms with a solemn nod, his chest heavy with the weight of both hope and guilt. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had been given a chance, fragile and uncertain though it was. Emily turned to gather her daughters, her voice softening as she called them back, but Jonathan stood rooted in the snow, watching the three of them together, the family he had once thrown away. He realized in that moment that no amount of wealth or success could ever compare to what stood before him. For the first time, he was determined to fight, not for power, not for pride, but for the love of the woman he had lost and the daughters he had never known he had. Jonathan returned the next day, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with a quiet determination that startled Emily. He stood outside the restaurant where she worked, waiting for her shift to end, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his hair damp from the storm that had rolled in over the mountains. When she saw him through the glass, her chest tightened with anger and unease, yet there was something in his stillness that gave her pause. He wasn't the commanding man she remembered from the past, barking orders and demanding attention. He looked almost small against the world, humbled in a way she had never thought possible. She wanted to send him away immediately, to tell him he had no place lingering near the fragile life she had built, but when she stepped outside and saw Sophia and Isabella rush toward him with innocent curiosity, she couldn't bring herself to deny them the chance to see who he really was. The first attempts at closeness were awkward. Jonathan knelt in the snow, his expensive gloves discarded as he clumsily helped the girls build a snowman. Isabella laughed at his uneven construction, scolding him playfully for not packing the snow tightly enough, while Sophia hovered at Emily's side, watching cautiously as if trying to decide whether he was safe. Emily noticed the way Jonathan looked at them, not just with fascination, but with reverence, as though every second in their presence was a gift he didn't deserve. That evening, when Emily tried to brush off the encounter as nothing more than a passing indulgence, Sophia surprised her by whispering that she liked the way the man listened to Isabella's chatter. The simple comment unsettled Emily more than she cared to admit, because she had spent years preparing to keep him at a distance, not imagining that her daughters might welcome him so easily. Jonathan began to return regularly. Sometimes he brought groceries, simple things like bread, milk, and fresh fruit, and Emily hated herself for noticing how much easier it made her week. Other times he carried children's books under his arm, reading to the twins in a voice so steady and warm that Emily, listening from the kitchen, felt something twist painfully inside her. He was not trying to overwhelm them with wealth, nor was he attempting to win Emily over with apologies. He seemed intent on showing them, day by day, that he was willing to work for their trust, to be present without expectation. He sat at their small table, shoulders hunched to fit into the cramped space, patiently helping Sophia trace letters in a workbook, while Isabella climbed into his lap demanding another story. Emily tried to resist the pull of these moments, but at night when the girls were asleep, she found herself staring at the ceiling and replaying the sound of their laughter with him. She remembered how different it had been 3 years ago, when his voice had been a weapon sharp enough to cut her down. Now, that same voice carried gentleness she didn't recognize. Yet her heart remained guarded. She told herself over and over that people did not change so easily, that regret could masquerade as love, and that her daughters could not afford another heartbreak. Still, Jonathan's persistence chipped away at her defenses. One evening, after a long day when Emily returned home exhausted, she found him already there, sitting on the floor with the twins as they painted pictures on scraps of paper. He looked up, his hands and shirt smeared with streaks of color, and smiled at her sheepishly. Something inside her cracked at the sight because it was so ordinary, so human, so far removed from the cold businessman who had once closed a door in her face. Later that night, when she tried to scold him for overstepping by coming to the apartment without her, his only response was an apology followed by a quiet confession that he wanted them to know they could count on him to be there, even when life was messy and imperfect. For Emily, trust remained the hardest barrier. She could not forget the nights she had held feverish children alone, whispering desperate prayers because she had no one to lean on. She could not erase the memory of hunger gnawing at her stomach as she pretended she wasn't hungry so the twins could eat. Those scars were not easily mended, and she reminded Jonathan of them every time he tried to apologize. But instead of defending himself or making excuses, he listened. He absorbed every word, every accusation, as though he believed he deserved each one. He did not try to argue that he had suffered too, or that his pride had blinded him. He simply acknowledged that he had failed her and their children. One night, after Sophia had fallen asleep with her head on his shoulder while he read, Jonathan remained in the quiet apartment, hesitant to leave. Emily, standing in the kitchen, felt the weight of his presence press against her resolve. She asked him bluntly what he wanted, why he was here, why he was suddenly willing to sacrifice his empire to sit in a cramped apartment with paint on his shirt. His answer came softly, without hesitation. He told her that wealth and success had never filled the emptiness that haunted him since the night he let her go, and that seeing their daughters had shown him what truly mattered. He admitted he was terrified of losing them again, but he would rather fight for them and be rejected than live another day pretending he didn't care. Emily did not respond, because the ache in her chest was too raw. She only nodded and told him that if he truly wanted to stay, he would need to prove it not for weeks, not for months, but for years. She told him that promises meant nothing without consistency, and that she would not forgive him easily, no matter how much he tried. He accepted her challenge with a solemn look, his eyes steady even as hers shimmered with the weight of old wounds. As the snow piled high outside and the mountain seemed to close in with silence, Emily realized her life had entered a fragile, uncertain new chapter. She didn't know if she could ever trust Jonathan again, but she could not deny the way her daughters already looked at him, nor the way her heart betrayed her in moments when his voice softened or his laughter filled the room. She told herself she was only enduring his presence for the sake of Sophia and Isabella, but deep down, in the corners of her heart she tried to ignore, she felt the dangerous flicker of hope. Winter in the mountains was often beautiful, but it also carried a sense of isolation that sometimes unsettled Emily. The small town where she lived was quiet, with only a handful of shops and the steady trickle of tourists who came for skiing or cozy weekends by the fire. Life had taken on a new rhythm with Jonathan hovering at the edges, slowly stepping into the world she had built with Sophia and Isabella. The girls had begun to expect him, their faces lighting up when they heard his knock at the door, their voices calling "Daddy" with an ease that made Emily's chest ache. She still told herself to be careful, to guard her heart, but watching the twins lean against him, their laughter echoing in the tiny apartment, she sometimes forgot to keep her walls high. Yet just when things began to feel almost safe, the past she thought she had buried came back in the most unsettling way. Jonathan's business life was never simple. Over the years, his position had earned him powerful allies but also dangerous enemies. While he had stepped back from the ruthless pace of the city to be here with Emily and the girls, not everyone in his world wanted him to find peace. Unbeknownst to Emily, whispers about his sudden disappearances and secrets had already circulated among people eager to use his vulnerability. The truth came crashing into their lives one evening as Emily walked home with the twins from the restaurant after her shift. Snow fell thickly, muffling their footsteps as the girls sang a silly rhyme, their small gloved hands tangled in hers. She was just beginning to relax when she noticed the dark vehicle idling near the end of the street. The sight made her uneasy, and her grip on the girl's hands tightened. The doors of the car opened, and two men stepped out, their faces shadowed by heavy hoods. They did not belong to this quiet town. Emily felt her heart seize with fear as they moved toward her, their steps deliberate. She pulled Sophia and Isabella behind her, her voice sharp as she told them to stay close. The men called her name, asking if she was the woman connected to Jonathan Hale. Her blood ran cold. It was Jonathan's world bleeding into hers, a world she had fought so hard to escape. One of the men stepped closer, his tone low and threatening as he told her that Jonathan owed things, that he had left loose ends behind. Emily could barely breathe as she tried to shield her daughters, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the night. Jonathan appeared from around the corner, his figure tall and imposing even against the snow. His coat was open, his hair damp from the storm, his expression a mixture of fury and protectiveness she had never seen before. He shouted at the men to leave, his voice carrying the authority that once ruled boardrooms but now burned with something more primal. The twins clutched at Emily, their eyes wide, but Jonathan was already moving forward, placing himself between them and the threat. The men exchanged sharp words with him, but his body was unyielding, his stance daring them to try and touch what now belonged to him to protect. Emily had seen him command board members and investors, but this was different, this was raw, dangerous, the kind of determination that came from love, not ambition. When one of the men stepped forward as if to challenge him, Jonathan lunged. The fight was short but violent, the snow spraying beneath their feet as Jonathan's fists connected with his opponent. Years of contained anger erupted, not for pride this time, but for his family. The other man backed away quickly, realizing they had underestimated him. Within moments they were retreating to their car, their muttered threats lost in the roar of the engine as they sped away into the storm. Silence followed, broken only by the heavy sound of Jonathan's breathing. He turned back to Emily, his face bruised and scraped, but his eyes steady. Emily's body trembled as adrenaline drained from her, the girls clinging tightly to her legs. For a long moment, she couldn't speak, her throat tight with the terror of what had almost happened. Then Jonathan crouched down, gathering the twins into his arms, holding them close as they cried into his coat. His voice was low and soothing as he promised they were safe, that nothing and no one would ever hurt them. Emily watched him, her heart torn between fear and something far more dangerous, the realization that he meant it. He would fight for them, not with words, not with empty promises, but with his own body if he had to. Later, when the girls were tucked safely into bed, Emily finally confronted him. Her voice shook with anger and fear as she demanded to know what kind of life he was dragging them into, whether this was only the beginning of more danger. Jonathan did not defend himself or minimize what had happened. He admitted the truth, that his world had always been cutthroat, that his decisions had created enemies, but that he had chosen her and the girls over all of it now. He told her that he would cut ties, burn bridges, walk away from everything if that was what it took to protect them. His face was earnest, his hands trembling as he reached for hers, and for the first time, she saw not the millionaire CEO but a man stripped bare by love and fear of loss. Emily pulled her hands away, pacing the small room, her mind in chaos. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let her heart soften at the sight of his vulnerability, but the memories of abandonment still burned too deep. Yet when she looked at him, bruised from a fight he had not needed to take but had chosen for them, and when she thought of the way Sophia and Isabella had clung to him for safety, she realized she could no longer deny that he was changing. He had crossed a line from words into action, and though her trust was not yet whole, a piece of her heart shifted toward him in that moment. That night Emily barely slept, her thoughts tangled between fear and fragile hope. She understood now that Jonathan's presence in their lives was no longer a question of whether she would allow it. The girls had already claimed him as their father, and fate had made it clear he was willing to fight for that role with everything he had. The only question that remained was whether she was strong enough to open the door he had once closed so cruelly, knowing that this time, if it was opened, it might never shut again. The snow began to melt slowly as spring crept into the mountains, leaving behind rivers of clear water that wound their way down the slopes. The days were growing longer, and with them came a strange sense of renewal that Emily could not quite ignore. She watched Sophia and Isabella chasing each other through the grass near the restaurant, their laughter ringing like bells, while Jonathan stood nearby, his eyes fixed on them with an expression that carried both pride and awe. It had been weeks since that night when strangers threatened their fragile peace, and though the fear of it still lingered in Emily's memory, what remained stronger was the image of Jonathan standing between them and danger, his body bruised but unyielding. It was that moment, more than any of his apologies, that had forced her to accept that he was not the same man who had once shut her out. He had been tested, and he had chosen them. Still, the scars of the past were not easily erased. Emily often found herself waking in the middle of the night, her heart pounding with old fears, remembering the slam of the mansion door and the sound of his voice telling her not to return. She struggled to reconcile the man who had cast her into darkness with the man who now sat at her kitchen table patiently braiding the twins' hair or quietly mending their broken toys with hands unused to such delicate work. She wondered if people could truly change or if Jonathan's newfound devotion was only temporary, born from guilt and the novelty of discovery. Yet each day he returned, and each day he showed her and the girls with his actions rather than his words that he was determined to remain. One evening, after closing her shift at the restaurant, Emily walked home with the girls and found Jonathan waiting by the small wooden fence of her apartment. The air was soft with the first signs of spring, and the lanterns along the street flickered warmly. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot in a way that seemed so unlike the confident CEO she remembered. When the girls ran to him, throwing their arms around his waist, Emily saw his face light up with a joy so pure it startled her. He scooped them up, listening to their chatter as though every word they spoke was a treasure. It was then that Emily felt her heart soften against her will, because there was no performance in the way he looked at them, there was only love. Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep tangled together in their small bed, Jonathan asked Emily to sit with him outside beneath the fading stars. She hesitated, wary of what he might say, but curiosity and a quiet tug in her heart led her to join him. They sat in silence at first, the cool air carrying the faint scent of pine, until he finally turned to her. His voice was steady but vulnerable as he told her that he was done pretending he could live two lives. He had already begun severing ties with the business world that had consumed him, stepping down from the empire he had once guarded so fiercely, because he realized that no fortune or title could replace what he had lost with her. He admitted he was afraid that she might never fully forgive him, but he was willing to spend the rest of his life proving that he deserved a place in their family. Emily listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind torn between disbelief and the pull of the sincerity in his words. For years she had built her life on distrust of him, teaching herself that he was the one door forever closed. Yet as she looked into his eyes that night, she did not see the arrogance that had once defined him. She saw a man stripped bare, humbled, desperate, and above all, determined to choose love over pride. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was no longer carrying the burden alone, where the twins grew up with a father who adored them and a partner who had learned from his mistakes. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke, telling him that forgiveness was not something she could give lightly, that the wounds he had left would never completely vanish. But she admitted that she no longer hated him, that watching him with Sophia and Isabella had shown her a side of him she had not believed existed. She confessed that part of her still loved him, though she had tried to bury that love under years of hurt, and that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop fighting the possibility of healing. Jonathan reached for her hand then, not with force but with the gentleness of a man afraid she might pull away. This time, she did not. Weeks later, Jonathan surprised them all. He arranged a small gathering in the garden behind the restaurant where Emily worked, a place filled with wildflowers and sunlight. Only a handful of townspeople attended, people who had become part of Emily's quiet life, and the twins who wore matching dresses and carried little baskets of petals. When Jonathan stood before Emily with a simple ring, his voice broke as he asked her to marry him, not as the man who had once dismissed her, but as the man who now knew her worth and the value of the family they had created. Emily felt tears spill down her cheeks as she whispered yes, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had chosen to believe in the future. Their wedding was simple, filled with laughter and sincerity rather than grandeur. Sophia and Isabella ran around the garden, scattering petals in their wake, their joy a symbol of everything that had brought Emily and Jonathan back together. When the vows were spoken, there were no empty promises of perfection, only a solemn pledge to choose one another every day, to stand together through darkness as well as light. As Jonathan kissed Emily under the fading sun, the twins squealed with delight and rushed into their arms, and the four of them held each other close as if afraid to ever let go. For Emily, the moment felt like the closing of a long, painful chapter and the beginning of something fragile but beautiful. She knew life would never be without its struggles, but as she looked at Jonathan and their daughters, she felt a peace she had not known since before the mansion door slammed shut. The man who had once told her not to come back had returned instead, humbled and transformed, and she had allowed herself to open the door to him once more. This time, she knew, it would stay open, and together they would build the home and the love they had once lost.